Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a really tough question. What do you do when your most powerful ally becomes your biggest uncertainty? We're going to unpack how countries are trying to navigate a world caught between the United States and China.
And look, this isn't just some academic thought experiment. This is the single biggest foreign policy challenge facing nations like Australia right now. And the answer? Well, it's a whole lot more complex than you might think. It really gets to the core of what global security even means in the 21st century.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we first need to understand the new global landscape. The old rulebook for how countries deal with each other, it's pretty much been thrown out, and everyone is scrambling to figure out the new game.
You know, for decades after the Cold War, things were relatively simple. America was the undisputed top dog. But that era, what people called the unipolar moment, is over. It's gone. A rising China and a, shall we say, more unpredictable America have completely changed the power dynamic.
And here is the problem in a nutshell. Take a country like Australia. The U.S. has always been its security blanket, its military protector. But China? China is its biggest trading partner, the engine that fuels its economy. So they're caught in this crazy balancing act, trying to walk a tightrope between their security and their prosperity.
So you hear this term thrown around all the time, right? The new Cold War. But is that really what's happening here? While it's a popular comparison, it might actually be more misleading than helpful.
Yeah, this is definitely not a repeat of the Cold War. The rivalry with the Soviet Union was a global ideological battle against an economy that was, frankly, a basket case. But the rivalry with China today, it's mainly economic, mostly regional, and it's against a country that's a deeply integrated economic powerhouse. The U.S. just isn't responding with that same kind of massive military buildup, and there's a good reason why.
And this quote from analyst Sam Raghaveen just hits the nail on the head. Trying to contain China is a monumental task. I mean, it's a huge economic player, woven into the fabric of the global economy. And unlike the USSR, it doesn't pose that same kind of existential, ideological threat to the world. A full-on confrontation just isn't in the cards.
So if it's not a new Cold War, then what's a smarter way for the U.S. to handle this rivalry? Well, it turns out there's an old playbook from the original Cold War that might have some answers.
This idea comes from a guy named Dean Acheson, a Cold War strategist. And his thinking was, look, instead of trying to be strong everywhere all at once, the U.S. should focus on creating situations of strength. The idea is to concentrate your power in a few key places, making it so strong that any adversary wouldn't even think about starting something.
And if you apply that strategy today, you can see where America's real strengths in Asia lie. You got the combined U.S. and Japanese navies in the East China Sea. That's a powerful deterrent. And then you have the U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula, backed up by South Korea's seriously powerful military. These are clear situations of strength.
But on the flip side, some areas are turning into situations of weakness. China's advanced missile tech, like the infamous carrier killer, makes it incredibly risky for U.S. aircraft carriers to get anywhere near Taiwan. And in the South China Sea, China's built these artificial islands and turned them into military bases, basically giving them control. In these spots, geography and modern weapons are definitely on China's side.
Okay, so this strategic shift brings us right to the heart of the problem for allies like Australia. They've placed this huge, high-stakes bet on American power, right? At the moment when that power is being seriously questioned.
Through pacts like AUKUS, that's the security deal between Australia, the UK, and the US, Australia is tying its military much more closely to America. We're talking about hosting things like strategic bombers and nuclear-powered submarines. What this really means is that Australian bases are now, for all intents and purposes, a part of America's war planning.
But here's the billion-dollar question. There are two very different ways to look at this. Is it reinforcement, a sign that America is committed to the region? Or is it actually a strategic retrenchment? Is the U.S. just moving its forces to safer, more distant bases in Australia because its closer bases, like the one in Guam, are now just too vulnerable to Chinese missiles? If that's the case, it could actually make deterrence weaker, not stronger.
So at the end of the day, what does this mean? It means by hosting these critical U.S. assets, Australia becomes a much bigger, much more obvious target for Chinese military planners in any future conflict. The bet isn't just on American power, it's a bet on American judgment.
And if that wasn't risky enough, that risk gets magnified, like exponentially, by the return of a leader who sees alliances not as a strength, but as a burden. A leader whose worldview is just completely different from anyone who came before.
And who better to explain this than former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who dealt with him directly. He describes a purely transactional worldview. In Trump's America First mindset, allies are often just seen as freeloaders who are taking advantage of the United States.
This story about a phone call is just, wow. It perfectly illustrates the chaotic, personality-driven world of dealing with Trump. So Turnbull's aides told him, whatever you do, don't bring up this refugee deal. But Turnbull brought it up anyway. Trump, of course, blew up, called it a horrible, disgusting deal. But in the end, he actually honored it. The lesson Turnbull learned was that the only thing that earns respect is standing your ground.
And this transactional, what's in it for me view extends to massive security commitments. Trump has publicly questioned why the U.S. should defend a wealthy Taiwan, which he claims stole America's chip industry, which, raises some pretty serious doubts about whether America would actually show up if an ally was in crisis.
So this all leaves allies facing a stark paradox and a really critical choice. The old assumptions that you could always count on America for protection, those are out the window, and it's forcing a complete rethink of foreign policy.
This right here is the absolute heart of the contradiction. Through deals like AUKUS, allies like Australia are tying themselves closer and closer to U.S. military power at the exact same moment that America's political commitment is less certain than it has ever been.
And this really presents two very different paths for how to respond. On one hand, you have what you might call the scramble, like when Canada's Justin Trudeau flew down to Mar-a-Lago hoping to get some assurances and leaving empty-handed. On the other hand, you have the stand, like Mexico's president, who responded to threats with unapologetic firmness, confident in her own country's power.
And this quote from analyst Emma Shortis just puts it all in such sharp relief. Daddy is not coming to save us. He is putting us in danger. Just think about that for a second. The long-held belief in this great protector might now be the very thing that creates the greatest risk. The alliance itself has become the danger.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to chew on. If that old security blanket is gone, or worse, if it's actually become a liability, what new possibilities open up? What could a nation actually achieve if it decided it wasn't going to be afraid anymore and chose to act in its own best interest?